In his essay, The Influence of Darwin on Philosophy, John Dewey drew attention to the ancient concept, the ancient conception of species, and the extent to which philosophy and science depended on the notion of the fixity of species, the principle of, to use his words, quote, a uniform type of structure and function seemed to give insight into the very nature of reality itself. The conception of ethos, a species, a fixed form and final cause, with the central principle of knowledge as well as of nature. Upon it rested the logic of science, close quote. Charles Darwin revolutionized modern thought, and in the process revolutionized much of the traditional subject matter of philosophy. That's what Dewey is getting at. His influence is pervasive, stretching across the humanities and the social sciences, biology, genetics, ethics, political theory. As a result of the Darwinian perspective, the traditional problems of knowledge, of conduct, and of governance refer now not to abstract principles, but to various modes of adaptation, to environmental pressures that work on us to adapt. With change now the dominating principle, the search for absolutes comes to seem anachronistic and naive. If Darwinian thought has had this effect, it has nonetheless not come to us full-blown from the brow of Zeus. Darwin, too, comes out of a context, to some extent, very much an Enlightenment context. The Enlightenment, after all, is a period that venerated the idea of progress, progress through conflict and competition. We find these precepts in any number of writings in Enlightenment philosophy, in social and political philosophy, not to mention more scientific productions of the period that actually anticipate central features of Darwinian theory. So let me quickly summarize the early influences on Darwin, just to get a clearer picture of the context in which his own ideas formed and, as it were, struggled for dominance in his own consciousness. He was born in Shrewsbury in 1809 to a physician father and the daughter of Joseph Wedgwood, the family famous for porcelain china. Darwin's schooling was unfocused and generally disappointing. Looks like early Newton again, do you see? He entered Edinburgh with a view toward medicine, finally finding both Edinburgh and medicine less than appealing. I mean, utterly unappealing. He moved next to Cambridge, now with a plan to study for the ministry. Thanks to the fates, he actually established a close friendship there with John Henslow, who taught biology. Their discussions turned Darwin's attention increasingly to biological subjects. Darwin then taking advantage of the invitation to take field trips with the geologist Adam Sedgwick. Now, through this influence and the encouragement of Henslow, Darwin made application for the position of naturalist on the HMS Beagle and served in that capacity from 1831 to 1836. When the voyage began, Darwin was 25, and the captain of the Beagle, Robert Fitzroy, was 26. At the conclusion of this long voyage, Darwin had a mountain of notes and now a thoroughly focused mind. His reading was systematic. He tells us that in October of 1838, he read Thomas Malthus's essay on population, quote, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence, which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be a new species. Here, then, I had at last got hold of a theory by which to work, close quote. Did he ever? In considering the influences on Darwin's thought, we mustn't overlook his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, 1731 to 1802, who also studied at Edinburgh and Cambridge, and was a good enough physician to have once had a chance to serve as George III's doctor. He was also an accomplished poet and inventor, and was highly regarded by such well-known inventors as Wedgwood and James Watt and Joseph Priestley. He combined his scientific and poetic talents in the book Zoonomia, in which, with rhyming couplets, he theorized that all varieties of living things evolved from an original type. Such influences duly noted, however, there's no lessening of Darwin's originality, not to mention the most painstaking and systematic program of data gathering, perhaps in the history of the natural sciences. Others had written about the plan and the order of nature, the fitness of plants and animals to meet the challenges of the natural world. But with Darwin, you do get something different. You get design without a designer. You get a teleological theory, a theory about ends being served by variation. But these are not ends contrived by some providential superintelligence. Now, in this connection, it's interesting to reflect on exchanges between Darwin and the American botanist Asa Gray, who had offered much support to Darwin's theory, indeed judged by Darwin as the person who best understood that theory. Now, what troubled Asa Gray was just this design without a designer, a teleological theory, but one for which the end, the Aristotelian that for the sake of which, is mere and brute survival. Darwin's respect for Asa Gray caused him to take these concerns seriously and to reply to them respectfully. In one letter he sends to Gray, he says this, quote, "It has always seemed to me that for an omnipotent and omniscient creator, to foresee is the same as to preordain. But then when I come to think over this, I get into an uncomfortable puzzle, something analogous with necessity and free will, or the origin of evil, or other subjects quite beyond the scope of the human intellect," close quote. In another exchange, Darwin tells Gray that given all the misery in the world, including the animal world, the suggestion that it's all part of a design by a beneficent creator seems to Darwin to be entirely unconvincing. After all, what sort of beneficent plan leads to the creation of, quote, "the ichneumonidas feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars," close quote. Now, you see the picture he's giving you is one creature living inside the body of another and living by consuming it. This doesn't look quite like a providentially created cosmos or world. As for the allegedly great and hostile controversy that surrounded the appearance of Origin of Species, it really is important here to separate fact from fiction. Now, at this point, I want to talk about Origin of Species. The book and its author received a respectful, even encomiastic reception in all the major literary journals of the period, the journals that would provide lengthy critical reviews of important books. Origin of Species was published in 1859. It was promptly reviewed in Dublin Review, the Edinburgh Review, London's Fortnightly Review, critical reviews that might run 40 pages in print. These reviews were remarkably detailed and highly positive. The publication that would come closest to a journal of official Roman Catholic opinion was the Dublin Review, and in that review, the reviewer does refer to an aspect of Darwin's work that he describes as a, quote, "horrid genealogy," close quote. But otherwise, it's an entirely respectful commentary, admiring of the scientist who's been so careful in presenting his findings, so systematic in his observations, etc. So that's the case for Origin of Species. We don't want to gild the lily. We don't want Darwin as the suffering, misunderstood sort of Dostoevskian character. Not at all. A highly respected naturalist who has served up a highly regarded, highly praised, in some respects worrisome work. But 11 years later, with The Descent of Man, there is a quite different reception, and indeed, this is a quite different book. One in which the ratio of fact to assumption is smaller by orders of magnitude. Natural selection, which was the theory of choice in Origin of Species, is now replaced by sexual selection. There's also a quite argumentative tone in Descent of Man, and of course there is that great inductive leap according to which the particular characteristics of our own humanity are now to be understood as lying along precisely the same continuum that covers all of animal life. Thus, what we are to understand about human nature is that it's an extension, an enlargement, perhaps some kind of elaboration of an animal nature that is there for all to see. Descent of Man is a controversial work, and I think it was intended to be. When Darwin added to this the expression of the emotions in animals and men, there would now be no room whatever for qualifying the radical implications of Darwinian thought. Now we are confronting an uncompromisingly evolutionary psychology in which human nature is not separated in any fundamental way from the balance of nature. Darwin was not flying here without a parachute. There were already important scientific developments that his theory required, particularly in the field of geology. If evolution was to account for the gradual creation of new types, far more time was required than the biblical span. Now, between 1830 and 1833, Charles Lyell had produced a monumental 3-volume work, creating something of a revolution in its own right. Close study of the fossil record made clear that whole species had been eliminated over the course of time. Moreover, these studies indicated further that the Earth was far older than anything anyone might have got from Scripture. Lyell and Hutton propounded a, quote, uniformitarian theory, close quote, according to which earthquakes and volcanic eruptions witnessed at the present time have occurred in much the same way over whole eons of time. Thus, the physical features of the world have, as it were, evolved slowly under various pressures. Lyell's Principles of Geology went through 12 editions and were praised frequently by his now good friend, Charles Darwin. Before considering Darwin's theoretical work, it is worth taking a few minutes to comment on theory as such, and the work that theories are to accomplish. One of the characteristics of a developed scientific theory, of the sort advanced by Newton or Einstein, is that it not only accounts for events, but it also predicts them. That is, there is a symmetry between explanation and prediction. So if we take the stock textbook example of dropping an object and noting that it falls toward the center of the Earth, we can explain this by the universal law of gravitation. All objects attract each other with a force directly proportioned to the product of their masses, inversely proportioned to the square of the distance between them. Now, by virtue of this law, we can explain the free fall of an object that's released from a height. But we can also predict what the object will do in the future, just in case we let it go. So a scientific theory is expected not only to account for what has happened, but predict what will happen. Now, it's worth noting that evolutionary theory has the right kind of retrodictive power. It does explain, or at least it purports to explain, how variations came about. But of course, it does not predict future forms. We have no idea what selection pressures might arise. We don't know what cataclysmic changes might take place in the world. We don't know if we're going to be hit by a meteor, or if dust clouds will eliminate giraffes. This has led some to wonder whether the theory of evolution is really cut from the same cloth as developed scientific theories. Indeed, Darwin himself described his method as the natural history method, and people in the 19th century would have understood what he meant by that. In a certain respect, Darwinian theory is much more like a kind of historical explanation, perhaps more like an historical explanation than a scientific one in the sense of Newtonian-type laws, etc. Now, some of Darwin's critics, as late as the second half of the 19th century, were insisting that Darwin here had not proceeded according to the established methods of Bacon and Newton. And in our own time, knowing in exquisite detail the microstructure of cells and the extraordinary micromechanisms by which cellular functions are accomplished, well, other scientists have concluded that natural selection accounts are simply far-fetched. I shall have to leave the matter at that point and return to Darwin's own time and scientific context, but I just want to insert these points lest we think we're following the natural history of something unfailingly true. It is an evolutionary theory, many strengths, some weaknesses, and some of the weaknesses are very telling. Now, among the other complaints against Darwin was that the fossil record, contrary to what Darwin's defenders were saying, was not incomplete. It was too complete for the good of the theory. If you take a look at the fossil strata that would have been available in Darwin's time to see what variations are taking place, you find no evidence whatever of some sort of linear progression of features, no evidence whatever of the appearance of a new species from gradual modifications of older types. That is, if you were to think of the fossil record as a kind of motion picture of evolutionary developments, you should see the actual emergence of a new species by the successful modification of earlier types. That's not what the fossil record showed. It would be Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of the theory, and a distinguished scientist in his own right, who would put forth in his book Darwinism that indeed, although the fossil record is complete, it's not an accurate record because of the nature of the upheavals that have taken place at the level of the strata. They provide a broken and shifted record. Indeed, Wallace argues, had the record been undisturbed, it would support the theory. So I'm just trying to bring the listener back into the controversial period surrounding the publication of these works. Now, yet another telling criticism was based on the history of breeding. Over a course of many centuries, and with all of the possible environmental controls at one's disposal, breeders attempting to refine any number of features nonetheless had never produced a new species. Darwin's era was not in possession of the science of genetics and the mechanisms by which mutations arise. Thus, Darwin and his contemporaries were not aware of the rapidity with which evolutionary changes can come about. Darwin's is a theory of gradualism, and indeed Lyell's geological work reinforced that view. Evolutionary theory does not offer the peaceable kingdom of a providential God. Rather, it offers a hellish place of violence, competition, and conflict. It's a bloody process that has mindlessly the means by which to liquidate, to make disappear anything that can't keep up, and to promote in number and in kind those able to succeed in the struggle for existence. It's a bleak picture. It was Herbert Spencer who used the expression survival of the fittest in his book Social Statics, which actually was published 8 years earlier than Origin of Species. Darwin borrowed the phrase, but he remained rather aloof to the radical libertarianism and social Darwinism advocated by Spencer. Now, the evolutionary principles advanced by Spencer were, unlike Darwin's, forged into an imperative. As progress depends on the achievements of the best, these are not to be held back by accommodating the needs of the less talented. I am inclined at this point to say that there's something of an apologia in a theory of this kind, given the nature of commercial life in Victorian England and places very much in the model of Victorian England. The idea of survival of the fittest and progress through competition captures much of the ethos of Victorian England. Spencer's interest in Malthus's prediction should be understood in these terms. The growth of population will exceed the capacity for the production of food, the effect being the starvation of the weakest members of society, and this being the process by which society prunes itself of its least fit. Now, how macabre that all this would attract the better minds of England, as Ireland's great famine would come to claim 3 million lives. Social Darwinism is but one of the implications arising from evolutionary theory, though one that Darwin would have rejected. Yet another implication is that what matters are collectives, not individuals. I want to pause for a second here, just to underscore this. Emphasis now shifts to the survival of a genre. The individual is consequential only insofar as it breeds and breeds true. So you already get a perspectival shift toward the fate of collectives, the individual now of instrumental but not individual value, so to speak. The forces of nature are such as to generate wide-ranging variations. Large populations are needed for there to be a wide range of variations on which natural selection can work productively. Nature, not consciously or providentially, but mindlessly and relentlessly, will favor certain variations and punish other variations. There's only a small set within the collective that may display variations guaranteeing success. So focus now shifts to the collective for the purpose of finding the unique instances that nature will favor. It is then not at all coincidental that Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, is writing on hereditary genius in 1869 and making a point of this, that if you take a large sample of human beings, there will be negligibly small numbers of truly exceptional instances, but that the entire race is finally going to depend on the achievements of that small group. Galton took the lead in establishing the British Eugenics Society, and he was a hero to those who founded a comparable society in the United States. Galton had tried to interest Darwin in the work of Mendel, but to little avail. However, Galton himself was totally committed to the hereditarian view of natural variations and to the need to improve society by genetic means. Remember the Socratic technique for producing guardians. Well, raise that by orders of magnitude and you begin to get Galton's perspective on these matters. He actually proposed cash payments for voluntary sterilization to those measuring low in estimates of intelligence. The amount of such payments were to be proportioned to the degree of mental deficiency. You get the picture here. Galton's scheme is to pay certain people not to reproduce, to sterilize themselves. How much you pay them more and more as your estimate of their mental ability finds them less and less. If nature can prune and purify at the level of intellect, so also can it select certain moral and ethical predispositions if these happen to enhance the adaptive potential of the species. Ethics then boils down to biology. Consider altruism. Evolutionary theory makes ample room for such a virtue as altruism. It even expects it. Animals behaving in an altruistic way, not favoring their own survival, but doing things that might benefit or aid or make more likely the survival of the species as a whole, are behaving in a way that's quite in keeping with natural selection. Until recently, very few moral philosophers would regard as altruistic behavior something causally brought about by natural selection. After all, one who simply comports himself selflessly would not qualify as altruistic, for as with all the virtues, the necessary ingredients begin with the conscious intention to serve the interest of others at one's own expense. Intentionality is everything here. You don't judge an act as altruistic in terms of its outcome, but in terms of what motivated the action in the first instance. But there is much to be said against this too, and I would not hazard a guess as to the fraction of today's philosophers who would accept socio-biological accounts of morals. I shall get to that question in one of the final lectures in the series. Now, Darwin himself made his reservations clear in more than one essay as to whether natural selection was a principle that ever could match up with what we take to be the ethical dimensions of life. And the question is alive to this day. The world bequeathed by Charles Darwin and his theories is an organic, evolving world. Nothing is fixed. All is in transition. This is no longer just the idea of progress. There are natural engines of change. Those engines are operating 24 hours each day. And what is it they're operating on? Why, they're operating on each of us, each of our characteristics, internal and external, behavioral, visceral, neurological. Each of these characteristics either does or does not meet the daily moment-to-moment challenge of survival, the survival of an organism that must keep itself alive by competing for resources. How this is going to be played out over the long haul, no one knows. We do know that the laws operate, and the question of who is most fit is answered only after the fact. The theory then assumes that beneath rationalized accounts of our various social and moral practices, behind the superficial self-congratulatory accounts of how good we are, how altruistic we are, how decent we are, there is a subtext in the form of laws of nature that achieve ends without intention, patterns without a pattern maker. There's something always at work behind the scenes. It brings things about that indeed our own rationality pompously takes credit for. But what is brought about doesn't come about as a result of our rationality. It comes about as a result of certain basic core impulses and instincts, which, if they were lacking, would make survival impossible. There are no fixed values, no eternal verities, no one-size-fits-all moral precept, no rule of conduct, form of law, form of social organization that is the last word. Rather, all is contingent. All is based on the moment-to-moment facts of the natural world and how these interact with what is finally a natural creature. There's no telling over the long haul which particular set of attributes will prove to be most serviceable. In the interest of survival, the best strategy is, as the Maoists cynically proclaimed, to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Well, what do we want to say about all this? In a previous lecture, I mentioned the speech that Huxley gave at Birmingham and the reply it evoked from Matthew Arnold. Defending himself against the charge of being one of those Levites of culture, as Huxley had called him, Arnold thumbed the pages of Descent of Man and confronted a long-lost relative, that hairy quadruped with a pointed ear and tail. Well, let me not repeat all that business about the hairy quadruped being inclined to Greek. Instead, I should underscore what Arnold is getting at, for it remains important to this day. The question is whether a theory of the evolutionary sort is the right kind of account as to what sort of creature we are, what kind of life we should live, how we should be governed. Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-founder of the theory, and a man deeply admired and respected by Darwin, wrote one of the best defenses of Darwinism. But in the final chapter, he asks whether the theory of natural selection succeeds as an explanation of human nature. And he identifies 3 domains so distinctly removed from the theory as not to be assimilated by it. There's first of all the domain of what might be called purely abstract thought, which seems to serve no particular evolutionary end. Then there's the domain of aesthetics, where resources are squandered in the interest of what is merely beautiful, and that surely cannot be serving the kinds of ends envisaged by the theory itself. And then there's the domain of moral thought and ethics, in which intentionally we sacrifice our most cherished interests for the benefit of others. Wallace cannot see how natural selection matches up with this, or how sexual selection matches up with it either. Wallace is inclined to think that in the aesthetic, intellectual, and moral dimensions of life, the theory just misses the point. Well, the debate goes on. E.O. Wilson has argued that natural selection shapes morals in much the way as it shapes other adaptive features. In his Sociobiology, a New Synthesis, he urges us to consider this, that, quote, a science of sociobiology, if coupled with neurophysiology, might transform the insights of ancient religions into a precise account of the evolutionary origins of ethics, and hence explain the reasons why we make certain moral choices instead of others. I don't think this is an apt account. I do think there's something in us that inclines us to Greek, but the late returns are not in.